Hi, I'll continue where I left off in the last video on the chapter on the brace from Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach's Versuch über die wahre Art des Klavier zu spielen. Der Mangel an Kennzeichen der Manieren außer unserem Instrumente nötigt also die Komponisten oft das Zeichen des T-Punkt dahin zu setzen, wo der Triller entweder wegen der Geschwindigkeit kaum möglich oder wegen der Schleifung ungeschickt ist. Das letzte Exempel mit zweierlei Endigung unter dem Titel Recit, von denen bei der ersten die letzte Note von dem Doppelschlage nicht wie gewöhnlich unterhalten wird, das Sprechen nachzuahmen, erfordert über der vorletzten Note in beiden Fällen ausdrücklich einen Doppelschlag. Da man nun unmöglich das Zeichen des T-Punkt hierbei setzen kann, so muss man, wenn man kein anderes hat, diese Noten der Diskretion der Spielenden überlassen. Perhaps after comparing both figure 31 from paragraph 20 and figure 57 from paragraph 16 to the examples of figure 58 that are attached to paragraph 17, in order to try and establish a pattern, the information of the first sentence jumped out at you in a way it might not have done so otherwise. Perhaps you noticed that you had developed an appetite for it. The trill is, because of the slur, unskillful, ungeschickt, or awkward, clumsy, when it's not in other cases practically impossible because of the speed. That is relayed so quickly, yet is key to recognizing and realizing all the information presented in the previous paragraph and its significance. So it can be tied together, the information, the trill, the slur, and the brace. Bach is explaining the slurs and the trill signs. He is telling us the point of all those examples of figure 58, what they are illustrating as a collective. The also of that first sentence in paragraph 18 is in direct reference to the preceding paragraph. That sentence is paragraph 17's conclusion. We have better context to what he says in paragraph 20 from the chapter on trills. It's not isolated information. It's like being in person with him and having a follow-up question. And here's how we might answer such follow-up questions, elaborating when he says the trills should hinder the adding of or the slurs should hinder the adding of a trill. You know, you can ask why or how. And this is like that. That's like as if you were with him and you had follow-up questions. He's answering those follow-up questions. So if I were to say the trill is the death of any slur, I'd wonder how off the mark I'd be. Placing the trill sign there where the trill has no seat is a way for composers to get around the handicap of not having signs of other ornaments at their disposal. They know using the trill sign in places where the trill has no business being is a way of indicating other ornaments to the performer. When one thinks of it, while it is a very resourceful way for composers to maximize the limited means at their disposal, this extended function of the trill sign is only going to work in those places where the trill has no seat. If done somewhere where the trill has a seat, then the performer is legitimately going to think the composer is specifically requesting a trill. So the composer is faced with a scenario, or faced with the reality that he only has the trill sign at his disposal. And normally that would mean he can only have a sign there where a trill is meant to go. But they they doubled the functionality of that sign by thinking, well, if we put it there where a trill has no business being, then the performer is going to know that what we want is another ornament. So it's a way of turning one sign into, like the one sign with one function, into the one sign with two functions. So it's quite resourceful, innovative to do that. It would seem that Bach, with the last example and its two types of conclusion, is providing advice for composers with regard to this practice, telling them in such a situation, if they have no brace sign, they'd be better off leaving it to the discretion of the player, since there's no way the trill sign can be used. Now, regardless of whether or not we understand exactly why Bach is saying what he's saying, this is still a glimpse into Bach's composing, of some of the thought processes that'll be going through his head as he faces and assesses situations, of how much information he is taking in and processing, and of how great the discrepancy is to those that make up the roll of honour, who are only able to take the score in at face value. That as much information is lost by the roll of honour as food is lost by a baby being spoon-fed. The food will be on its bib, on its face, its hands, the high chair, on the spoon. Only a part of the food is going to get into the baby. That's what it's like with the roll of honour. You know, and they'll even, some will take this, you know, surface level, shallow understanding of the score, like where they only understand it at face value, and they'll take it to the, you know, their thing will become, they'll chase that carrot better than anybody else chases, and then they'll have their students adhering completely to the face value, or the surface level understanding of the score, and they'll stop their student as soon as they're not completely obeying and worshipping the surface level understanding of the score. So as soon as they stray from a surface level understanding of the score, they'll be stopped and pulled back into the cage. And so that'll be the thing where professors will feel that makes them legitimate or quality professors, because they do that. You can see how pathetic it is. Recit is an abbreviation of recitative, and we get some interpretation information from Bach that such a passage with such an indication should imitate speaking, and that perhaps a detached quality is a characteristic of speech. You might already know that from other sources, but now you're hearing it from Bach too. So you'll hear a recitative in an opera, and that'll be between arias, or between the main songs of that opera. And it's a place where, you know, they'll help kind of move the plot along, and, you know, get the information across, and it'll be sort of a spoken song. They'll sing to harmonies being played. Yeah, that's a recitative, and so. Yeah, so it has a speaking quality, and so you're hearing from Bach that, and interpretation advice on how to understand that. And at the end of Schubert's Erlkönig, that song, Schubert writes in Recit, there, and the last line that's sung or sung spoken. Yeah. So why should both cases explicitly require the sign of a brace over the second last note? And why can one not possibly use the trill sign, the T or dot sign? I'm not going to profess to have the definitive answer, but I can take a look. Or alternatively, you could ask your Lilliput professors why. And since you're paying them, you'd be legitimate in having them go deeper for once in their careers. You'd be entitled to that they should go deeper for and not give some glib kind of answer to fob you off, to get rid of you, keeping them from their Nespresso machine. So I can take a look. Firstly, the shortage of signs of ornaments outside of our instrument consequently obliges composers to often set the sign of the trill there where the trill is either due to the speed hardly possible or, on account of the legato, clumsy or unskillful. As far as speed is concerned, I would speculate that a trill in the first Recit example would be possible. And one could look at the examples 1 and 3 from figure 58 and look at the rhythmic character, that dotted note, and then the last note being the repeated middle note. And then one could look at the G sharp and A's in that Recit example. And you can see the G sharp is dotted, and then the A with the brace over it is the repeated middle note. Plus, there is none of that slurring that would make a trill unskillful. So a trill sign there might actually mean a trill to those performers that understand the language being spoken, which, if the composer didn't want a trill, wouldn't be the correct answer. So a communication breakdown, mixed messages. When the composers are being resourceful, having limited signs at their disposal, uses the trill sign, creates a double function of the trill sign. Well, if they use that where a trill is legitimately able to be, well, then they're breaking those rules, the rules they've made. And what you get then is, mixed messages, a communication breakdown. It has to follow its own rules. Bach marks both versions of this last example with asterisks, meaning no other ornament works. So that means the trill doesn't work there in that example. And you could think, well, hold on a second. If you do look at that example 1 and 3, the trill does work there. So why is the brace the only ornament that'll work in that one? And so Bach does provide one of the reasons why the composer wouldn't want a trill. That the last note of the brace is not held out as usual in order to imitate speaking. Were a trill played in its place, the trill would be joining its last notes with the following note rapidly, which means there wouldn't be that space between the notes to emulate that speaking quality. That's why the trill would be incorrect, why it doesn't have a place there. I mean, that's one of the reasons Bach gives. Could it be that there are no trills in speech? I just throw that in there. So the speaking effect would be undermined, a communication breakdown. The composer would be putting the trill sign there because he has no sign for the brace. But the performer wouldn't understand it in the way, since the trill could have a place there. And so, it's just, it doesn't help. It doesn't help. It. And with the second ending, we see a piano sign. Why is it there? What is its purpose? Is it just because personally Bach prefers it played piano, and that is what interpretation is, what expression is? One listens to a number of recordings and picks out those things they like best and make their interpretation an amalgamation of those details. That it's all derivative. It's all about personal preference, about who to copy. It goes no deeper than that. Or is it because of what Bach said in paragraph 16? That appoggiaturas that don't repeat the preceding note do not suffer a brace over them. If it were, the piano sign would be there to tell us that the F is not an appoggiatura, and more specifically, that it's not one of those appoggiaturas that doesn't repeat its preceding note, which do not suffer a brace. I present it as a question, but I know that's why it's there. So perhaps a trill sign could cause ambiguity. While the player might rule out the trill in this case because of the slur, there could be a danger of him also ruling out the brace. The P indication might not be enough. And given the asterisk and what that means, it could be that in this case, having no ornament is better than having any other ornament that is not a brace. I would wonder if the piano sign is there for the sake of the example, as a heads up to those who might spot the potential discrepancy between what Bach just said in paragraph 16 and this example, and that it might not necessarily have appeared in another context. Somehow I doubt it, but anyone spotting that, I would admire their perceptiveness. Yet Bach is still on top of it. He wouldn't have been caught out as having contradicted himself. So anybody who spots that, hold on, there's that looks like an appoggiatura that's not repeating its preceding note, yet Bach is giving it a brace, even though he said it doesn't suffer a brace. So anybody who spots that, you could think, well, they're definitely paying attention. This is something that could easily go unnoticed, and the Roll of Honour won't notice it. Lilliput won't notice it. But even though it's so good to have spotted that, Bach is still there. It's not good enough to kind of catch Bach out. And that's the level that Bach is operating on. And it makes Bernreiter claiming that Bach doesn't know how to use the words before or after, or any of that stuff on the Prahl trill. It makes it all the more ridiculous. Like, you can see what a low level they're scurrying around at. And Bach is way above them. And he's so far above, they have no conception of it. Just like, they're like ants who have no conception of us because we're too big. It would also be an example of his sophistication and inventiveness as a composer. Just like with expression and interpretation, one doesn't get to decide if they want the F to be an appoggiatura or not, unless they are in the cage, where you can do what you like because nothing matters. as soon as, you know, all those people in the past who've ceased to exist, they cease to exist anymore afterwards. Nothing they did was of any relevance. So you can do what you like, it doesn't matter. It's anyway just notes and noise. So knock yourself out. Pick and choose whatever you want. Just don't do it if you're thinking of, you know, building a plane, because it's going to crash. It's not going to fly. But when you don't play music, who notices that? Who is able to spot that music isn't being played? Nobody. Nearly nobody. There are exceptions, thankfully. In light of all that, one could wonder the significance of Bach writing in the sign of the brace in the previous example marked with an X, and if we could analyse that situation in the same way. So you could wonder about that, because nothing Bach does is to be overlooked or insignificant or just arbitrary. It serves a purpose. You can see how much information will be lost or not even picked up on at all by Lilliput. Although Bach did not mark that example with an asterisk. So he didn't mark that example with an asterisk, but he did write in the sign of the brace. So one could wonder. This is just an example of how one can be curious. Yeah, so that's why I say that. Just an example of how you can be curious. And if you're, you know, if you were curious about a pattern or discovering the pattern, well then you'll see, like you'd notice that the point of all those examples of figure 58, that what you see is examples with slurs, the combination of the slur and the trill sign, the lack of slurs and the trill sign, and all that, how it is part of a language that is understood. And if you're not paying attention to any of that, all of that is lost. You're just looking for, you know, catchphrases or things, convenient things you can use, and you'll bypass all those examples and you'll get none of the insight. And what is the insight? The trill is the death of the slur. And why does the composer not simply write in a brace? Bach says it, but what are the logistics of what he says? You could wonder that, well, if they know the brace sign, why don't they write it in? And I don't know the answer. I mean, I'm not. But one thing I could think of, a possibility, is that he's talking to composers. And composers, you know, the compositions are going to be printed. And it might not matter that they know the sign of the brace, or that they might use the brace or any other ornament. What matters is they're told what the printer can do, like what signs are available for printing. And just like, you know, and printing will have been technology then, and the acquisition of new signs might have been expensive. And a printing company might, you know, they might not want to commit to that expense unless it pays off. You know, so the composer could be given the printer could say to the composer or the publisher, look, here's the signs we have that you can use. And so the composer is stuck to pick, even though there might be 6 others he would have liked to have had, he has to make do. And that will explain the absence of the brace sign in Mozart's earlier sonatas. He just didn't have it available to him. So he'll have been using this. extra function of the trill sign. And I'm sure if everything I say is wrong, all your Lilliput professors will have already told you all of this. None of this will be new. And they'll have told you specifically regarding trill signs and slurs and the areas where it's, and they won't have just, you know, given a superficial, like, get rid of you quickly sort of made such a comment about it. Yeah, so it might not be relevant. And another thing would be in the time, you know, if you think that piano or keyboard won't have been as mainstream or such a large section of classical music at the time, and so the publisher might not want to print those signs, or the publisher might not want to print those signs, because why would they? Only a small number of people know them who aren't. So, and what does it pay off? And they're publishing music to be maybe, you know, multi-purpose, and that there'll be other instruments that are more popular in the public that'll be used for, rather than just, you know, keyboard instruments. So I'd say there's lots of reasons why that will make sense, but it's like whatever technology is available. I had a friend who had a music program, and it could do, you know, it didn't cater for triplets. And if you imagine somebody using that, and let's say 200 years ago, and you just take what they've done using this music program, you might think that they didn't know about the triplet, where in reality, the reality was, it was the technology that couldn't cater for the triplet. So in their life outside of the technology, the triplet was alive and well and there, but they had to leave it out or get around it somehow within the context of the technology. And so that's what you're seeing here. Maybe the technology at the time doesn't encompass the entire spectrum of, you know, what was done at the time, and that was implicitly understood, and there was measures done to get around that. So it would mean what he said in the last paragraph would be relevant for printed scores of piano music too. So when he says outside of the piano it's not known, but it would as well mean that even though it's piano music, they'd still be subject to the same limitations, because it could have been the state of printing at the time. So the piano, unless like a publisher, but they might not have wanted to specialize or in keyboard music at the time, because it wasn't big enough. There wasn't a big enough market. So it would mean that the sign of the brace is absent in piano scores too, because they're printed by the same people who print music for other instruments besides piano. Okay, I'll leave it at that for today, and I'll pick up where I left off in the next video. Thanks.